Imagine a young woman standing in the desert of New Mexico in 1945. She is one of the few people on Earth who understands the terrifying physics behind the white-hot flash of the world's first atomic bomb. As a scientist on the Manhattan Project, Joan Hinton has the kind of career most people would kill for access to the inner sanctums of American power and a future of prestige. But then she disappears. A few years later, she resurfaces, but not in a high-tech laboratory or a prestigious university. Instead, she's found in a remote, dusty village in rural China, knee-deep in mud, obsessing over the mechanical design of a better milk pressure cooker and the health of dairy cows. Beside her is her husband, Erwin Engst, who left a comfortable life in the U.S. to study cattle breeding in the middle of a revolution. When asked why she gave up the secrets of the atom for the smell of manure and damp earth, she didn't talk about geopolitics or grand theories. She simply acted as if there was nowhere else in the world more important to be. It's a jarring image, highly trained Westerners walking away from luxury and status to embed themselves in a country that, at the time, was struggling with basic survival. And they weren't the only ones. There was the American doctor, George Hayden, who became the first foreigner to take Chinese citizenship, spending his nights in the most impoverished corners of the country, fighting diseases no one else wanted to touch. There was the British intellectual Gladys Yang, who spent decades painstakingly translating ancient Chinese scrolls while the world outside her window was being rebuilt from scratch. What's fascinating is that these people weren't experts sent on a temporary mission or guests looking for an exotic adventure. They were something far more complex, internationalists. They arrived at a time when the new China was little more than a dream and a lot of ruins. They gave up their passports, their comfort, and sometimes their safety to become partners in a project that didn't even belong to their own people. Looking at their lives today, it feels almost alien. In an age of transactional careers and borders that feel more like walls, the logic of these individuals who treated the struggles of a foreign nation as their own poses a haunting question. What did they see in those early, chaotic days of a new republic that made them turn their backs on the West and never look back? Okay, so let's unpack this. That story of Joan Hinton is it's incredible.
It really is. It's almost impossible to imagine today.
Right. So our mission for this deep dive is to really analyze what these people, these internationalists, were actually building. Because it wasn't just, isolated acts of kindness.
No, not at all. It was part of a foundational project for an entire nation.
Exactly. So we've structured this exploration to give you a shortcut, really, to understanding how China's industrial state capacity evolved and the unique logic behind it. We've pulled three big themes from the sources.
Okay.
First, the absolute foundational layer, the social structure built through public health and agriculture. The real basics.
The survival stuff.
The survival stuff. Second, the hard tech industrial base, and specifically this idea of a strategic transfer of know-how. That's a huge piece of the puzzle. And finally, the unique systemic logic, the sort of the underlying operating system that allowed this whole thing to even happen.
And that framing is so important because these actions, whether we're talking about Joan Hinton on her farm or the state building a steel mill, they weren't just charitable. They were strategic. They were deliberate transfers of knowledge, of know-how into a system that was explicitly designed to absorb it and use it immediately.
A system built for results.
Absolutely. The sources talk about a focus on result-oriented collective survival and tangible technological progress.
Yeah.
These weren't buzzwords. They were the non-negotiable foundation for the state to become resilient. It was the only shot they had, really, starting from such a low base.
Okay, so let's start at that foundational layer, public health. Because you can't build anything if your population is sick. And the sources, they paint an absolutely brutal picture of the reality in early 20th century China.
Oh, it's stark. And you have to put it in context. This wasn't just a matter of people not washing their hands. This was the result of centuries of systemic poverty, war, and a near total lack of modern infrastructure.
Right. So what does that actually look like on the ground?
The historical analyses are, they don't pull any punches. They describe widespread practices like people defecating and urinating indiscriminately in public spaces. Just wherever. Openly spitting mucus on the streets, throwing fruit peels and waste, and inside homes, an accumulation of dirt and filth. It sounds shocking to us, but this was the baseline.
And that baseline means the entire country is it's a giant petri dish.
It's a massive, uncontrolled reservoir for infectious diseases. And the new government knew they had to attack this problem on day one.
But the scale, the sheer scale of the challenge is almost impossible to get your head around.
It's immense. Think about the numbers. Over 80% of the population was illiterate.
80%.
So you can't just print some flyers about hygiene. A public information campaign based on written words is useless for most of the country.
So it has to be visual or oral.
Exactly. It has to be experiential. Songs, performances, town meetings. And then there's the geography. We're talking about roughly 500 million impoverished farmers spread across a massive landmass.
It's not like you can just build a few hospitals in Beijing and Shanghai and call it a day.
Not even close. And on top of all that, you have this deep cultural resistance. The sources mention these ingrained anti-scientific customs rooted in tradition that often directly contradicted modern medicine.
Like what, for example?
Things like traditional burial rites that could spread disease, or certain ways of handling human waste that were part of the agricultural cycle but also spread parasites. You aren't just teaching new habits, you're asking people to abandon beliefs they'd held for generations.
So if you can't rely on money and you can't rely on written education, you have to get creative. You have to make public health political.
You have to make it a collective duty. And that brings us to this really remarkable social project, the Patriotic Health Movement.
Right. This was launched in the 50s and ran for decades. What made it so effective?
I think it's radical pragmatism. The government knew it couldn't afford or enforce Western-style sanitation overnight. It was just impossible.
So they didn't aim for perfection.
They aimed for progress. The sources describe it as a speculative but ultimately workable approach. They linked basic health concerns directly to political dynamics, to people's livelihoods, to cultural pride.
So it wasn't just be clean for your health, it was be clean for the new nation.
Precisely. They turned hygiene into a collective political act. It was your duty as a citizen. They used every mass media channel they had, simple songs, street theater, neighborhood committees, to drill this message home.
A full-scale mobilization. A war on dirt.
A war on dirt and disease. And you can see the tangible results. They weren't just raising awareness. They were getting things done on the ground.
Okay, so what did they accomplish?
Well, on one level, they dramatically improved environmental sanitation across the country. Simple things that had a huge impact. Moving waste away from drinking water sources, digging basic latrines, organizing neighborhood cleanups.
And this is where the famous Four Pests campaign comes in, right? This is the big, visible project.
That was the one that caught the world's attention. The campaign targeted rats, flies, mosquitoes, and bedbugs.
Why those four specifically?
Because they were the most obvious and direct vectors for disease. Get rid of the flies and mosquitoes, and you immediately reduce the spread of things like malaria and dysentery. It was a very practical, high-impact target. And it required everyone to participate, sweeping, draining, stagnant water, setting traps.
A real grassroots effort.
It was massive. But beyond the pests, they were also tackling the big endemic killers.
Things that had plagued regions for centuries.
Exactly. They successfully controlled the vectors for major disorders like malaria and schistosomiasis.
Schistosomiasis. That's the one with the snails and the rice paddies.
That's the one. A debilitating parasitic disease. By changing irrigation practices and targeting the snails, they made a huge difference to the health and productivity of the rural workforce.
And I imagine immunization was a huge part of this too.
Absolutely critical. Mass immunization campaigns against smallpox, diphtheria, tuberculosis, diseases that had previously just torn through the population. This is what starts to rapidly push life expectancy up from that incredibly low baseline.
So what's amazing about this is that none of it is really high-tech medicine. It's brute force public works, basic hygiene, and mass organization.
That's the key takeaway. It's proving the incredible effectiveness of mass mobilization. You can achieve massive public health gains with very little money if you have the organizational capacity to get millions of people working together.
And this model actually got noticed internationally, didn't it?
It did. The system, for all its, rudimentary aspects, was incredibly effective. It heavily influenced the World Health Organization's primary healthcare initiative.
Wow.
At the 1978 Alma-Ata Conference, which was a landmark event for global public health, the Chinese model was held up as an example of what was possible in low-resource settings. The international community saw that you didn't need a billion-dollar hospital system to make huge strides.
But even with all that success, you still have the problem of care. You've cleaned things up, but people still get sick.
Yeah.
The sources are clear that a full professional welfare system was just not financially possible.
Not even close.
Yeah.
The country was still incredibly poor. So they couldn't afford to put a fully trained, university-educated doctor in every single village.
So how do you solve that? How do you staff this new health system?
That's where you get this absolutely ingenious organizational solution. The Barefoot Doctors.
This is such a fascinating concept.
It emerged around 1965, and it was a direct, and I'd say brilliant response to that economic reality.
So who were they exactly? These weren't fully trained physicians.
Not at all. They were typically local farmers or maybe young people who had finished high school. They'd received some very basic short-term medical training.
How short?
Sometimes just 3 to 6 months. They got the name Barefoot Doctors. They literally worked in the fields, often barefoot, alongside everyone else. They'd only put on their medical coat, so to speak, when someone needed help.
And what was their role? What could you do with just a few months of training?
Their philosophy was summed up by the phrase, ban nong ban yi, part farming, part medicine. They weren't doing brain surgery. Their job was simple, but absolutely critical for that idea of collective survival.
Prevention, mostly.
A lot of prevention, yes. Giving immunizations, teaching hygiene, recognizing the signs of common infectious diseases, and crucially, a huge focus on reducing infant mortality rates. Basic prenatal care, safe delivery practices, they were the first line of defense.
And because they were locals, they were trusted.
That's a huge part of it. They understood the community, the local dialect, the traditions. They were far more effective than some outsider from the city would have been. And this idea just exploded in scale.
What were the numbers like?
By 1978, the sources say there were 1.8 million barefoot doctors across rural China.
1.8 million? That's an entire parallel health system built on volunteers.
It's an enormous decentralized human capital resource. It's the ultimate solution to the resource problem.
But a network that big needs some kind of structure, some kind of institutional backbone to support it.
It does, and that was the cooperative medical system, or CMS.
So the CMS was the financing and delivery mechanism.
Exactly. It was established within the rural communes. Think of it as a kind of local prepaid health insurance scheme. It was funded by community contributions, a little from collective welfare funds, and a small government subsidy.
And this is what paid for the medicines and supplies the Barefoot Doctors used?
Yes. It provided the structural support. And it expanded incredibly quickly during the Cultural Revolution, when there's a huge political push for rural health. By 1976, something like 93% of communes had a CMS.
Wow. So they built a near-universal grassroots healthcare system from basically nothing.
They did. It was this deep institutional reach that made the whole thing work. It embedded preventive care right into the fabric of the community.
Okay, now let's connect this all back to our opening story, to the internationalists. Because they weren't just observers, they were active participants, and in some cases, leaders in this public health revolution.
They really were.
Yeah.
This is where that idea of result-oriented collective survival becomes a deeply personal choice for these individuals.
So let's take George Hatem, or Mahade, as he was known, an American doctor.
Who became the first foreigner to ever take Chinese citizenship. And he dedicated his entire life, not to some fancy hospital in a big city, but to fighting two of the most stigmatized and difficult diseases. Leprosy and venereal diseases.
Diseases that were huge social and medical problems.
Huge. And his work was so effective that he achieved basic eradication of these conditions across massive parts of the country.
Right.
His entire focus was on tangible, measurable results that improved the collective.
And then there was Hans Müller, the German doctor.
Müller's contribution was a bit different. While the Barefoot Doctors were building the foundation, he was helping to build the next level of the medical infrastructure. He stayed in China to focus on hepatitis research and vaccine development.
More complex, higher-level challenges.
Right. And he also helped establish new, more efficient hospital management systems. So he was building the capacity for the state to handle more complex medical issues as it developed.
But the most striking example, the one we keep coming back to, is Joan Hinton, the nuclear physicist.
It's the starkest contrast imaginable. From the absolute pinnacle of Western high-tech science, the Manhattan Project, to a dairy farm in rural China.
It's so hard to understand that choice from a modern perspective. Do the sources give us any insight into the personal philosophy that drove someone like her?
They suggest it was born from a deep disillusionment with where the West was heading, especially with the nuclear weapons she had helped create.
A crisis of conscience.
A profound one. And at the same time, a deep belief in the potential of the Chinese Revolution to genuinely lift millions of the poorest people on Earth out of misery.
So for her and her husband, Erwin Engst, the move from abstract physics to tangible engineering wasn't a step down. It was a moral step up.
That's how they saw it. Her entire focus shifted to results you could touch and measure. That continuous flow milk pasteurizer she designed. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was essential.
Why milk specifically?
Because she understood that for a nation to be strong, its children needed to be strong. Collective survival depends on safe, accessible protein for the next generation.
So that single piece of agricultural engineering, ensuring a safe milk supply, was arguably a more important contribution to long-term national stability at that moment than any theoretical physics paper she could have written.
In that context, absolutely. It was a choice that prioritized immediate, widespread human benefit over elite, high-status research. So whether it's Hayden fighting disease or Hinton designing machinery, these internationalists were helping to lay the absolute physiological and social foundation for the new state.
Right, but as you said, physical health and safe milk, that's the foundation, but it doesn't build a modern, sovereign state that can defend itself. For that, you need steel, you need industry.
You need an industrial engine, which means we have to pivot to the next phase, the strategic absorption of global expertise.
Okay, so post-1949, the new government has this one massive overriding goal: build a modern industrial system from basically nothing.
From scratch. They were coming out of decades of war, invasion, civil war. They simply did not have the independent expertise or the capital to do it alone.
And this necessity leads them straight to the Soviet Union.
It does. It leads directly to the 1950 Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship and this adoption of the Soviet-style big push industrial strategy.
The big push, what does that mean in practice?
It's a state-led development model. The core idea is massive, centralized, and simultaneous public investment into heavy capital-intensive industries.
So steel, energy, machine tools,
Yeah.
the building blocks of an industrial economy.
Exactly. The Soviets had done it themselves, rapidly industrializing in the 20s and 30s, so they were providing the blueprint. And the vehicle for this whole transfer was a set of projects known as the 156 projects.
And when we talk about the scale of these projects, the numbers in the sources are just mind-boggling. They really show the level of ambition and maybe desperation.
It's arguably the largest single technology transfer in human history up to that point. They call it the 156 projects, but it was really 139 core industrial clusters.
And the cost.
The total value was about $80 billion in 2020 figures. Now, to put that in perspective, that was equivalent to 45.7% of China's entire GDP in 1949.
Almost half the entire economic output of the country for a year.
Invested in this one industrial push. It was an all-in bet on building heavy industrial capacity. Steel alone got almost half of the total investment.
It sounds like this overwhelming flood of Soviet aid, but the sources make a really critical distinction about what was being transferred. It wasn't just money and machines.
No, and this is the most important part of the story. The transfer happened on two levels, and one proved to be far, far more valuable in the long run.
Okay, so the first level is the obvious one.
The obvious one is what the sources call technology transfer. This is the physical stuff. State-of-the-art, Soviet machinery, heavy equipment, and incredibly detailed blueprints for entire factories.
And this alone was a huge leap forward.
It was revolutionary. In some sectors, China's industrial tech was a century behind the West. This transfer basically closed that gap in 10 years. That kind of acceleration is almost unheard of in history.
But the sources stress that this physical capital, the machines, wasn't the main driver of long-term success. It was the second type of transfer.
It was the know-how transfer. This is the human element, the intellectual systems.
For not just the what, but the how.
And the why. This involved comprehensive in-plant technical training. Soviet experts engineers, production supervisors were sent to China to work side by side with their Chinese counterparts.
For how long?
On average, they were expected to stay for 3 years. This wasn't a 2-week consulting gig. This was a deep embedding of human capital.
So they weren't just handing over an instruction manual, they were teaching a whole new way of thinking.
A whole new way of thinking about industrial production. It was a deep injection of modern engineering discipline. They taught operational planning, which was often non-existent. They introduced statistical quality control methods.
Which was a huge deal, right? Because the old system often just prioritized raw tonnage over quality.
Exactly, which led to enormous waste. They also instituted what they called duty management, a system where the outgoing shift would meticulously inspect and hand over the machinery in perfect working order to the next shift. It was about creating a culture of continuous, high-efficiency production.
This 3-year partnership sounds like a direct injection of an entire industrial mindset.
It was, into the very psyche of Chinese industry. But here's where history provides this perfect, if completely accidental, natural experiment.
You're talking about the Sino-Soviet split?
Right, the political falling out between the two countries in 1960. It created this accidental laboratory where researchers could study the long-term difference between getting the machines versus getting the knowledge to run the machines.
Because the aid didn't stop cleanly.
Not at all. The rollout of the 156 projects was already having issues. Bottlenecks, accidents, problems with translators. Then in July 1960, the split happens, and the Soviets abruptly withdraw all their experts. The aid just stops overnight.
Which must have been chaos for the projects that were midstream.
It was. And it meant that the 304 steel plants that were supposed to be built or upgraded fell into 3 distinct measurable groups.
Okay, what were the groups?
First, you have the lucky ones. They got both the Soviet capital and the full know-how training before the experts left. That was about 32% of the plants.
Okay.
Then you had the second group. They received the physical capital only. The machines and blueprints arrived, but the Soviet experts were pulled out before they could do the training. That was about 30%.
And the third group?
The control group, basically. They received no Soviet transfers at all. The projects were canceled before anything arrived. That was the remaining 38%. Because this was all determined by the random timing of the split, you can compare their performance over the next 40 years.
And the sources give this perfect, specific example of the Red October blast furnace to illustrate this.
It's the perfect case study. The plan was to duplicate a top-of-the-line Soviet furnace at 3 different steel plants: Baotou, Tangshan, and Taiwan.
So let's start with Baotou. They were the lucky ones.
Baotou got the full package. They received the physical furnace, and the Soviet expert team managed to complete the full training on quality control and operations just before the split. The result: the sources call Baotou an impressive, modern, giant metallurgical complex known for its high-quality output.
Okay, now Tangshan, they got the machine.
They got the massive, expensive, brand-new blast furnace,
right,
all the hardware. But the Soviet experts were forced to leave before they could provide the critical training.
So they had the tech, but not the operating manual.
Worse, they lacked the human operating system. The workers were left to just copy the Soviet designs without thinking, as one report put it. They didn't understand the engineering principles behind the material tolerances or the processes.
And the result was predictable.
Immediate and disastrous. The products had many flaws and enormous scrapped output. They had a high-tech machine that was essentially producing high-tech scrap metal.
And the third plant, Taiwan.
Taiwan was the control group. Due to a fire at the Soviet factory and then the split, they got nothing. No new furnace. They just had to keep operating with their mix of old, domestic, and 1930s era equipment.
So you have these 3 perfect test cases, and the performance data from the next 4 decades is just, it's undeniable.
It's one of the most powerful findings in development economics. The production advantages that came from having the physical capital only, they were incredibly short-lived.
The machines wore out.
They wore out, they broke down, and without the engineering knowledge to repair them, upgrade them, or adapt the processes, that temporary boost just evaporated. The advantage was statistically insignificant after about 6 years and totally gone after 20.
So buying the fancy machine gives you a few good years, and then you're back where you started.
Or worse, because now you have an obsolete piece of junk you can't fix. It's the perfect illustration that physical capital is transient. But the plants that got both know-how and capital, that's a completely different story.
Your advantage persisted.
It didn't just persist, it grew. Their production and productivity were about 20% higher than the capital-only plants within 20 years. And here's the kicker.
Yeah.
It kept growing. After 40 years, the cumulative effect was a productivity advantage of roughly 50%.
50%. Sustained over 4 decades, all from that initial 3-year injection of training.
That's the power of human capital. The know-how was the gift that kept on giving. It was the catalyst for internal, sustained innovation, which became absolutely essential when China was cut off from the world.
Right, let's talk about that mechanism. How did these know-how plants maintain their edge during the 60s and 70s when China was basically a closed economy under a Western embargo?
Because they had the foundational engineering expertise, they could innovate from within. They figured out how to increase the production of high-quality steel by adapting the Soviet processes. They even developed new steel-making processes internally.
And critically, they could build their own replacements.
That's the key. When the original Soviet equipment eventually became obsolete, they could design and adopt modern, domestically produced machinery to replace it. The capital-only plants couldn't do that. They were stuck, waiting for foreign spare parts that were never going to come.
And this must have created a different kind of workforce in those plants over time.
A measurable difference.
Yeah.
The sources show that the know-how plants consistently employed more engineers and high-skilled technicians and fewer low-skilled workers. And they weren't just hiring them, they were creating them.
What do you mean?
They set up their own internal training programs, their own factory-based schools for engineers. This became a vital channel for preserving and spreading that knowledge, especially during the chaos of the Cultural Revolution when national universities were shut down. The knowledge became institutionalized within the factory walls.
Okay, now let's fast forward to 1978. China opens up. How did these different plants react to the chance to engage with the global economy?
The data here is so telling. It shows just how much more sophisticated the know-how plants had become. For starters, they imported 17.2% less foreign equipment for simple replacement.
Because they didn't need it as much. They'd maintain their own stuff.
Exactly. But at the same time, they imported 20.4% more foreign equipment that was complementary to what they already had.
So they weren't just replacing broken parts. They were strategically upgrading.
They knew exactly what piece of German or Japanese tech they needed to integrate into their existing production line to make it even better. That shows a high level of engineering maturity.
And I assume this translated into better performance in the market.
Directly. Because their products were consistently higher quality, they engaged way more in international trade. They exported 33.9% more steel and produced 32.0% more steel that met international quality standards.
So that initial Soviet know-how transfer didn't just help them survive isolation, it positioned them to become world-class exporters decades later.
That's the long-term impact. And it didn't just stay within those factories. The sources also talk about a spillover effect.
The knowledge started to diffuse into the local economy.
Right. And it was very specific. Only the businesses that had direct links to the know-how plants, their suppliers, their downstream customers, showed higher productivity and technological upgrades. It confirms that engineering knowledge spreads through networks, creating these powerful local ecosystems of industrial capability.
Now, the Soviet connection ended in 1960, but China's strategy of absorbing foreign expertise didn't stop there. There was a second wave, wasn't there?
A massive second wave after the collapse of the Soviet Union. This demonstrates just how central this strategy was to their thinking. They launched something called the Double Introduction Project.
Double introduction of what?
Technology and technical talent. They went on a hiring spree. Tens of thousands of former Soviet experts, especially from Ukraine, which had a lot of the key military-industrial complexes, were brought to China.
And they worked on some very strategic projects.
Over 2,000 projects in the decade after the collapse. And the results were game changers in key areas. Advanced jet engines, naval gas turbines, tank engines, aerodynamic design for missiles.
And the most famous example, of course, is the aircraft carrier.
The acquisition of the Varyag carrier prototype from Ukraine. That project was heavily supported by former Soviet naval architects and engineers. It became the foundation for China's entire aircraft carrier program, allowing them to leapfrog decades of painful, expensive development.
And it's important to contrast this all-in approach to absorption with the kind of limited cooperation they were getting from the West at the time.
The contrast is stark. You had programs like the Peace Parole with the U.S. in the 80s to upgrade fighter jets, but it was always limited, always restricted to purely defensive tech. The West was cautious.
Whereas Europe was a bit more open.
A bit more, because they didn't have the same direct geopolitical rivalry at the time. But the bigger picture is clear. China's entire development path was defined by this relentless strategic acquisition and, crucially, the internalization of foreign know-how, wherever they could get it, with the ultimate goal of building their own self-reliance.
Okay, so we've established the social foundation, public health, and the industrial foundation built on absorbing know-how. Now we need to look at the big picture, the systemic logic that ties it all together. Why this specific path? Why this obsession with engineering and collective stability?
The sources put it in a deep historical context. This drive for industrialization wasn't just about economics. For the past 150 years, it was seen as the only answer to foreign imperialism from the Europeans, the Japanese, and later the U.S. embargo.
So industrialization equals sovereignty.
It was the vital means to secure national independence. It wasn't a choice. It was seen as a necessity for survival.
But to pull off an industrialization project that massive, you need a colossal amount of capital. And unlike the early Western industrial powers, China had no colonies to exploit for cheap resources and captive markets.
Right, and that fundamental constraint forced them down a very different and much harder economic path. The sources call it internal exploitation or internal colonialism.
What does that mean exactly?
It means that since you can't extract resources from external colonies, you have to systemically extract the surplus value from your own rural sector to fund the heavy industrial build-out in the cities.
And the institution that made this possible was rural collectivization.
The People's Commune, specifically. It served as the institutional mechanism to achieve this extraction at a very low transaction cost.
So how did they actually pull this surplus from the countryside?
Two main ways. The first was just mobilizing cheap, sometimes unpaid, peasant labor for massive state infrastructure projects. But the more systemic mechanism was the price scissor system.
The price scissors. Explain that.
The state deliberately set the prices for agricultural goods, grain, cotton, at an artificially low level. At the same time, they set the prices for the industrial goods that farmers had to buy, tools, fertilizer, tractors, at a high level.
So they were squeezed from both sides.
Exactly. That gap, that scissor, effectively siphoned wealth from the rural sector to the urban industrial sector day after day, year after year. The estimated value of that transfer over the first 60 years is staggering, something like 17.3 trillion RMB. That was the price the peasantry paid to build the country's industrial engine.
The ultimate cost of primitive capital accumulation. But the sources point out this dual structure, the urban hukou registration system versus the rural population, had this incredible unintended long-term consequence.
A hugely important one. The rural sector, despite being the source of this extraction, became the great stabilizer for the entire system. The system of collective land ownership in the countryside, which was preserved, performed two essential stabilizing functions. First, it maintained this huge pool of labor with very low social reproduction costs.
Meaning the state didn't have to pay the full bill for these workers' lives.
Exactly. Because migrant workers always had a home and a small plot of land to go back to, the state didn't have to pay for their housing, their health care, their retirement in the cities. This is what created the incredibly cheap labor that was the foundation of the China price, its comparative advantage in manufacturing.
And the second function was even more critical during a crisis. It acted as a national shock absorber.
A giant pressure valve. The best example is the 2008 global financial crisis.
Right. The export markets just collapsed overnight.
And 20 million migrant workers in the coastal factories lost their jobs almost instantly. Now, in almost any other developing country, that is a recipe for a social and political disaster.
You'd have massive urban unrest, slums exploding.
A total collapse of the urban welfare system. But that's not what happened. Because of the collective land system, those 20 million people didn't become a permanent destabilizing urban underclass.
They just went home.
They just went home, back to their village, back to their small plot of land. They weren't productive for the national economy anymore, but they weren't a burden on the urban state either. They could still feed themselves. The system decentralized the social cost of the crisis.
That's a fascinating and powerful mechanism for stability. And the sources trace this capacity for recovery back even further, right, into deep history.
They do. They connect it to the millennia-long challenge of just surviving in the Chinese heartland. Managing the massive, complex irrigation systems for the Yangtze and Yellow Rivers required intense cooperation and centralized management of common resources.
Survival depended on mass mobilization.
It demanded that communities work together and accept centralized direction for critical projects. That legacy, that DNA of crisis management through internal cooperation is still embedded in the system's logic.
And this combination of stability and know-how absorption is what ultimately leads to what the sources call the engineering state. This is presented as a core distinction in understanding modern geopolitics.
It is. The sources frame the current competition as one between the U.S., which they characterize as a lawyerly society.
Good at obstruction, as they put it.
Good at creating procedural rules, protecting existing interests, and yes, obstruction. And on the other side, China as an engineering state, which is dedicated entirely to construction, physical output, and measurable results.
And you see this prioritization of engineers at the absolute highest levels of power.
It's baked into the political structure. Deng Xiaoping famously promoted engineers to the top ranks because he believed they were the ones who could deliver tangible results. By 2002, every single member of the Politburo Standing Committee had an engineering background.
And Xi Jinping himself is a chemical engineer.
He is. And he has systematically filled the Politburo with executives from the aerospace and weapons industries. It's a clear signal that the priorities are defense, massive infrastructure, and strategic technology, the domain of the engineer.
And what do engineers do? They build. The sheer speed and scale of construction is probably the most concrete evidence of this philosophy.
It's hard to even comprehend. China has compressed over a century of American infrastructure development into about 2 decades. The highway system is twice the length of the entire U.S. interstate system. The high-speed rail network is 20 times more extensive than Japan's.
And they have that wild example from Guizhou province.
It's the perfect illustration of the build it and they will come mentality. Guizhou is one of China's poorest provinces, yet it has better infrastructure than some of America's richest states.
It has 45 of the world's 100 highest bridges.
Exactly. These bridges cut travel times between remote mountain towns from hours down to minutes. And even if they're initially criticized as bridges to nowhere, the sources note that nowhere often becomes somewhere a few years later. The construction itself is the policy lever that forces development to happen.
This obsession with physical output then spills over into the entire economy, defining China's role as the world's factory.
The rule of thumb is that China produces somewhere between 1/3 of almost every major manufactured product in the world. Steel, solar panels, container ships, you name it.
And the solar panel example is a great one.
It is, because the massive drop in the global price of solar power over the last decade wasn't really driven by some new scientific breakthrough in a lab, which is what America excels at. It was driven by China's relentless focus on manufacturing engineering and scaled-up production, their core strength.
So to bring this all together, we should go back to the perspective of those early internationalists, like Israel Epstein. How did they see this system?
They saw something that a lot of Western observers missed. They didn't just see a country.
They saw a civilization state.
A civilization state, reclaiming its own historical resilience through its own unique logic. And that logic values technological mastery, physical construction, and systemic stability above all else. It prioritizes them over Western ideas of procedural justice or individual rights.
The ultimate goal is the tangible result.
The tangible result and the maintenance of social order. That's the worldview that makes Joan Hinton's choice to leave the atom bomb for a dairy farm completely rational. It's what makes George Hayden's decision to fight disease in remote villages make perfect sense. They were embedding their expertise into a system that was institutionally and strategically designed to absorb it for one purpose: rapid, measurable physical advancement and long-term collective survival.
This has been a truly comprehensive journey. We've gone from the microscopic, the battle against pests and disease, all the way up to the massive scale of building an industrial base, and finally to the systemic logic that holds it all together.
We started with that incredible personal choice of a nuclear physicist leaving Los Alamos for a dairy farm in Shaanxi.
And what we found is that her choice wasn't some historical accident. It was a perfect reflection of this deeply practical, results-oriented, foundational project.
A project that unfolded in 3 interconnected stages. First, that absolute quest for collective survival through public health and agricultural improvement.
Right. Then the strategic absorption of industrial know-how, which the data proves was far more valuable than the machines themselves.
And finally, the institutional prioritization of physical construction and systemic stability. The rise of what we're calling the engineering state, which was built on that foundation of rural stability and centralized control.
And the key takeaway really is that the long-term success of China's initial modernization wasn't determined by the big infusion of foreign money or machines, that physical capital that just faded away after 6 years.
No. It was determined by the persistent integration and diffusion of foreign knowledge, of technical expertise, the engineering know-how. It was absorbed into a system uniquely designed to leverage it for rapid, measurable physical advancement. The internationalists, by making that very personal choice to embed their expertise, ended up fueling this very distinctive path to systemic resilience.